After some technical difficulties, we're here. Ryan, thanks for joining me today. I'm looking forward to having a chat with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So, why don't we start with a bit of an intro? You are involved in a project. I think it's called the Regenaissance, and I've been doing a lot of podcasts over the last, I guess, 2 years now about this kind of growing phenomenon that seems to have a lot of uptake in the Bitcoin space, which is that of regenerative ranching / farming. And so why don't you tell me kind of what your angle is and what you're doing with it all and how you got there, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah. So I guess because my last 2.5 years have been pretty crazy, and it's what essentially led me to this apparel brand, because it's called the Regenaissance, and it's taking regenerative and Renaissance combined. And I guess the two parts is regenerative agriculture, but also just regenerating your health, because obviously in America, we're a really, really sick nation. And there's also just the last few generations just continue to spread lies, such as that butter and steak and eggs are bad for you, saturated fat's bad for you, that red meat causes cancer. So there's all this information out there that's hard to really parse through. And so I'm pushing back to that because there's a big agenda being pushed on that other side of the movement. We're being told more of a plant-based movement, placing animal agriculture. They're pitting that against climate change, which all of that is just complete lies. So I'm trying to make this an awareness / just educational type movement, because I was actually vegan for 2.5 years and I realized how wrong that was. But when you think about the vegan movement, they're really, really loud, and they're only about 2 or 3% of the population, but you'd think it's a lot more. There's really nothing on the other side of that per se. And so I'm just, essentially trying to do just that. And then also it's not just diet and connecting back to our land with regenerative agriculture and farmers and ranchers, but also trying to take a holistic approach, because it's not just that. You need to really get outside in the sunlight. I mean, that was one of the biggest things that I've changed in my lifestyle personally. That's been huge beneficial. Movement and exercise, sleep and stress, all of that plays a huge part. And so I'm just really trying to bring that together as a movement. And then the last thing too, so my clothes, I'm trying to have natural fibers, because again, our apparel industry is also really, really screwed up. And I mean, that's dating back to the 70s when we started outsourcing all of our production essentially. And now the materials, a lot of them are super toxic too. So there's just so many different things in our, I guess, environment that are also just really toxic for us. And I'm just trying to push back to all of
that. Just a quick note on that. What would, are you talking about like bamboo fiber? Would that be a more, like the growing methods are better for the environment, and the, maybe, or hemp, and the impact on the environment is less for growing those sorts of things, or what are you using, like organic cotton, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so the shirts currently are organic cotton, and I plan to have much more clothes released, but using cotton and linen, potentially hemp and bamboo. But I'm trying to really avoid polyester and all these other synthetic fibers that are, I didn't even learn about this until last year, just how toxic they are for the environment, but especially for us. Because, for example, polyester, there's a lot of research done that has caused testicular cancer. So for us guys wearing shorts and spandex and underwear made out of polyester, whenever you're working out, really anything, it builds over time, and it's just very toxic for us.
Yeah, I remember I went down that rabbit hole. I think it was like 2010. I was living in China, and I, read up on just how damaging to the environment cotton farming was, and all the chemicals and pesticides and stuff used. And I ended up getting a bunch of, I got a suit made, a bunch of t-shirts, like a bunch of other articles of clothing made of either hemp or bamboo or both. And it was actually, great, very comfortable. The processing has improved over time. Especially bamboo can be very soft and nice, and even hemp can be. I like the feel of it, and it's apparently more breathable, and it's less, it collects less bacteria in it and all that sort of jazz. So I definitely, and that's not something the environmentalists generally think about. Their focus is so much on one thing that they miss. And I don't have the stats in front of me, but I remember back in the day when I was researching this, being shocked at just how much the cotton industry was contributing to, you know, environmental degradation and the use of chemicals and pesticides, and how that was leaching into the environment. And of course, how much, you know, how that was impacting people who were wearing the, you know, that clothing. And, you know, it's, as so many of us are, well, have been finding out for a long time, perhaps, and but even, you know, seemingly more recently, there's a lot of stones that when you turn them over, it's not what you thought it was, whether it's in the realm of food or finance or clothing or environment, or like name one, medicine. It's just,
Yeah.
and we're almost in a place where it's the inverse, you know, like that's why I think we call it clown world, because it's like, not only is it wrong, but so often it's actually perfectly wrong in terms
Mhm.
of like, it's the truth is the exact opposite of what's being, you know, propagated in the culture or the mainstream or the news or whatever.
I mean, that's a really valid point, especially with, I don't think most folks realize with cotton too, how much it's heavily sprayed, because it's one of the most heavily sprayed crops. And that's another point that I'm trying to really work with my brand long term is only 3% of the world's organic cotton productions in the US. Most of it is China, India, and I believe there's another country I can't remember. But I really want to change that as well, because you can integrate that into regenerative agriculture, but it's obviously a challenge. And
Mhm.
but as I guess the brand expands, I really want to eventually have direct relationships with farmers that are doing that.
Yeah, Regenaissance is a sick name, by the way. It's perfect.
I wish I could take credit for it. It was my friend.
Nice. Was this like, were you into Bitcoin prior to kind of getting interested in regenerative agriculture? Like, which one came first?
Yeah, so I was fortunate with my older brother. He really tried, he's was in Bitcoin for a while and he was trying to really get me into that. And like a lot of people, I just pushed back for a while. And it wasn't until 2017 that I bought my first Bitcoin and was fully invested into it all. And I think what really was the catalyst was listening to Andreas Antonopoulos on Joe Rogan. He did two podcasts, I think in like 2014 and 2016. And he gave like a really real world examples with his Greece background. And so that really got the wheel started spinning. And then as I was talking to him more and more with that, it made sense and just clicked.
And what was the lead into the regenerative agriculture stuff? Like, was it because it had started bubbling up in the Bitcoin space, or was it something outside of that? Like, why, how did this all come about?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of really serious family, I guess, family experiences the last couple of years because I'm coming at it from a tech background. But right at the start of the pandemic, I received news that my brother had stage 3 colon cancer. So fast forward to December of 2020, I had found out that that had progressed to stage 4. And I knew leading up to that, that if that was going to happen, I was going to take time off work and be his caretaker just because he was easily the most important person in my life. But also, I just would not be able to live with myself if I was just working in Austin while he is just completely suffering. So the first 6 months of 2021, I took off work and was his caretaker and essentially watched him be tortured to death. And he passed away on June 11th of that year. But on top of that, my mom was also in really, really poor health. She was forced to retire in 2019 from her health. So she was already declining as well. So I was also helping take care of her. And after he passed away, obviously it was extremely traumatic experience. I knew I didn't want to go back to work. So I actually quit from IBM and I withdrew my 401k, not knowing what the hell I wanted to do with my life, but I wanted to try to figure that out and bet myself. So that took a while and I was trying different things. I was actually thinking about doing like Bitcoin consultancy in terms of like educating businesses, but my heart really wasn't in it enough. And then it was actually Twitter to where I started learning about regenerative agriculture and that just clicked. Just really going back to our food production because my whole life I'd been extremely disconnected. I couldn't remember the last time I actually visited a farm. I don't know if I really had ever gone to a farmer's market. And so I just really took a deep dive in that, started to take this class from Rizoma Field School on Twitter. That's a homestead, but also just talking about regenerative agriculture practices. And so just from there, it just kind of snowballed to where I started traveling around America and I visited some ranches. And then through that, I discovered woofing, which I don't know if you're familiar with woofing.
Doesn't ring a bell.
So that's an acronym WWOOF, and it stands for Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And it's a great organization where essentially in exchange for your labor, you get housing and food. So last fall, which is actually when I shared my story on Twitter, was the very first farm I worked on in Pennsylvania for a few months. And then again, that just really opened up my eyes to that whole world. And I realized once I shared that on Twitter that, I mean, my story went viral from that overnight. And I realized people really wanted to see that because, like me, it just opens up your eyes to, oh yeah, I've been so disconnected to all of this, and I want to see what actually happens behind closed doors, essentially. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. That's kind of where I really led into regenerative agriculture and just kept snowballing.
And so is the current project mostly focused on education and awareness, or do you have, plans, or are you currently engaged in farming in some capacity? Or like, are you still
So,
doing the woofing, or are you doing your own thing? Or
so currently I'm just focusing on the brand. Long term, I still want to start my own ranch, but the whole thing with this brand is I really just want to bridge that gap and trying to figure out ways how I can do that as well through my website. And yeah, that's part of the fun with this brand is there's so many different avenues you can really go with it. But the biggest thing is education and awareness.
yeah, there are so many areas, there's so many ways you could go with it, because everything comes from the soil, basically, like
Mhm.
everything that we are, the water, the minerals, everything comes from there, and it all starts there. And of course it draws energy from the sun, and then plants grow, and then the animals eat the plants, we eat the animals, and so on and so forth. And it really, I think it'll be potentially one of the primary ways in which our current time is characterized in the future, is just the degree that we've been disconnected from basically all the fundamental things that sustain us. And so you could characterize one of those fundamental things that sustain us as obviously our food, right? And
Mhm.
being so detached from the processes that are involved in that, and so detached from the natural order of what comes from that, so much refinement, so much additive, so much extraction, to the point where, and by the way, I'm very sorry to hear about, your brother, because of course that's a tragic thing, but so many people are in the circumstance where, and there's almost never, it's really hard to draw direct lines of causation with things like health and diet and that kind of stuff. But over the course of time, we can notice, like, generally which behaviors lead to the better outcomes. And it's just
Mhm.
so obvious in the culture today that so many of the bad outcomes we see, not just in like straight up physiological health, but in mental health and in, all the other areas that one might optimize themselves. So much of it is due to that detachment from nature, basically,
Mhm.
and the food that comes from that and naturally comes from that. And I would say, another one that seems to be getting a lot of interest in the Bitcoin space, which I like to explore with some guests, is, another one is like detached from something higher, whether you call it a spirituality or God or whatever, like the detachment from that thing that you're supposed to have, or that you have that you could be better oriented by, let's say, like
Mhm.
that thing, whatever, it's a highly contentious topic, of course, but whatever that might be, that's another form of detachment, form of fundamental detachment, that I think is leading to many of the negative outcomes that we're seeing in the culture today. And so I think, like, wind the clock forward 100 years or 500 years or whatever, and people will look back and say, like, they'll look at all the detachment from so many of the things that we're supposed to be more connected to in order to facilitate a flourishing life, family, community, culture, nation, whatever. And I guess part of the interesting question there is, like, what are, like, we could probably easily identify, like, how some of those detachments occurred, right? Like the food industrial complex and fiat and subsidies and all this kind of stuff, kind of guiding people to consume food that is detached and not good for them. But in all these cases, it's like, what are you're detaching from those things, and what are you putting in its place? And I guess the answer is you're putting either garbage or harmful things, or things that are less true or untrue.
Mhm.
And I think, the other main way in which our era might be characterized is the kind of the glorification of the self, so I think
Mhm.
people are being detached from all these things and uh, overly attaching to their self or their ego. And that also comes with a whole host of behaviors that are disconnected, inharmonious, and ultimately detrimental to one's health and the health of a family or a community or, you know, broader collective. So it's I look forward, well, maybe I won't be around for it, but it'll be interesting if I am, to see how this era is reflected, because it's always so hard to you know, look at your own era when you're in it, right? Much as we might try, as introspective as we might be, as much as we might attempt to decondition ourselves from, you know, the time we're in, it's so hard. And in hindsight, it becomes so easy to identify, you know, and I think detachment will be a big one for us.
I'm curious too, just based off of that, because to me, especially from a culture standpoint, especially in the West, of how fast it changed. And I'm 29. I don't know how old you are, but I'm curious if just in your history, like in your lifetime, it just seems like the last 10 years, maybe you can even say like 5 years, it just changed so rapidly. And I didn't know if you had experienced that in previous time, or is this just really the last 5 years to where it's just a huge shift?
I don't know, man. As soon as I've always been fairly curious / skeptical. And as soon as I started looking into this stuff, it was apparent how egregious that detachment was, you know? So even when I was a teenager and I started looking at all this stuff, so like in the early 2000s, let's say, it was all fucked then too, you know, like maybe things have, things have accelerated, you know, because whatever we identify as being most causative here, let's just as a stand-in use the degradation of fiat money and the fiat money system, right? Like as that kind of spirals down or devolves further, then you would expect all the things which it produces to do the same. And so I think, you know, you could probably characterize it that way and identify why it might be accelerating or getting worse and worse now. But even back then, you know, the food industry looked like it was totally messed up. Politics, banking, and finance. Like I can't think of something that wasn't that way. And then, you know, you think you could probably say the same for the 90s and the 80s. And I mean, when was a period? This is always the challenge in history too, and the challenge for people not to exclusively want to harken back to a bygone era, because we probably see in it what we want to see. Like we might say, oh, like the 60s was the best decade in America, right? Because, you know, you had the moon landing and you had Bretton Woods system and you had you didn't have the corruption and all these things yet. And after that, you know, 1971 is when everything went off the rails. And of course, like there's good arguments to be made that there are inflection points where things accelerate or change dramatically. But I think, you know, you got to look back and say things were never perfect. And, you know, so things were probably always off the rails to some degree, but we can still look back and try to avoid at a minimum the mistakes that we've made in the past. And then with the current circumstances, with the technologies and whatever other opportunities we have at our disposal now, look forward and say, what kind of world do we want and how do we constitute that? Like, how do we build that with what we have? And I think, you know, that's why you're doing what you're doing. And so many of us have our, you know, the way in which we're trying to contribute to that and say, like, I think that this is actually the importance, and that this is an axe I've been grinding, you know, especially during the COVID years, the importance of like fundamental values and principles, because those are the things that guide your behavior. Those are the things that help you judge or assess the validity of anything that you might encounter, whether it's a government dictate or a, you know, corporate whatever, or food, or what, like how much does it, to the point, how much does it cohere or detach, right, from these values or principles? And what was so scary about the COVID years is like, it seemed like most people in normie land completely, like that assessment wasn't part of their, those questions weren't a part of their assessment, you know? And so like the values and principles were not even considered in the face of emergency, or you might die, or you have to do this because you were told to. And that's what, you know, really, I think shakes the foundations of any sort of semblance of a civilized or peaceful or prosperous culture, is that you know which values and principles are basically sacrosanct, because they are the very things that give you a chance at peace and prosperity, basically. And if you do away with them, and there's many examples of this throughout history, then things devolve very rapidly because you don't really have a way of judging things. You don't really have a North Star. And so you know, everything is relative. Everything is just based on whose opinion has the most weight or the most power, the most influence in the moment. And things devolve very rapidly. And so yeah, that was a concern during COVID time. And I think now, I mean, with the emergence of Bitcoin, I think that's actually reversing, right? I mean, I think we're not only have Bitcoin as a type of principle, but it's also instigating these conversations about what principles are most generative to a thriving individual and culture, let's say. And so I mean, I don't know if I'm hopeful that we've reached peak clown world, but I'm very apprehensive about claiming that because I don't want to shoot myself in the foot or jinx myself. But I feel like the COVID years hopefully were an apex of that. And now with all these initiatives that we often talk about, and I'm sure you and I have both familiarized ourselves with, it's like there's so much good stuff happening, and it seems to be grounded in these principles and grounded in appreciation for our connection to nature and all of these things, and an appreciation for how that connection elucidates greater health in all the different areas it might be construed, but that would kind of give credence to your point that the last 10 years or the last 5 years in particular have been particularly wild because, perhaps they were the years leading up to the very tip of the clownishness.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's three things I had with that too, because going back to you mentioning about spirituality and I guess what you believe in, I've noticed that trend of lack of religion in America coinciding with just the destruction of our culture. And I used to not believe that because for the longest time I was agnostic. And actually at the time my brother passed, we were both technically agnostic, but that was actually a catalyst to going back. And now I'm back to being a believer. And yeah, I don't know, that just makes me think about that all the time of just that trend. And then the second thing too, going back to with my brother, I remember at the time he passed because he was 32 and he got cancer. I was wondering why did he get cancer of all things and why him? And it makes me think about just how common cancer is for so many people. And for the longest time, I couldn't understand that, but it makes a lot of sense now. There's just, like I was going back to saying, there's just so much toxicity, and cancer is just the last line of defense just to all the toxins built up in your body. And for my brother, it made a lot of sense why he got cancer, especially colon cancer. He was an alcoholic. He drank really heavy beers every single day. Because I remember I lived with him for a little bit and I tried to get him to stop. But yeah, he just really liked beer. He didn't eat the best. He stayed indoors all day, essentially. He lifted weights, but didn't really get any exercise. And then I wholeheartedly believe that kind of unlocked the gene in my family because my grandfather passed away from the same thing when he was in his 40s. And again, that's why I have the Regenaissance, is because we have the answers to push back to all that. And I mean, as humans, we're tribal too. So if we have something that people really believe in, but they're not, I guess, necessarily too confident to speak out against at first, but see something that they could be behind, I think that could really work, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to start this.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask I mean, you mentioned a little bit that it was kind of what happened in your experiences with your brother, but what was it that kind of led you to faith either again or for the first time?
Yeah, so it was actually working on the farm, and I started to understand why so many farmers are religious themselves. You just have a really deep connection to the land and the animals, and it just makes you start reflecting on everything again, everything being life and how it is all really connected, how nature communicates with one another. And that was really the I guess jumping point. And then actually the farm I worked on, the owners were religious themselves, so we just had awesome conversations about all of that too.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, again, this is one of those things that we'll look back in hindsight, right? We look at bloodletting now and be like, wow, how stupid. Now, the asterisk by that is, some people still think, and I don't know where I stand on it, that like some people say you should give blood regularly because it causes you to, regenerate blood cells and that's good for you. So who knows what the real truth is, but suffice it to say that as an example, we used to think that bloodletting was just a ridiculous sort of thing to have done for medicine in the past, right? And I think, again, we'll look back and say, well, of course they had all of the, all these cancers and other diseases, because look at the environment they were in. Look at all the different toxins that they were subjected to on a daily basis in the modern era, from everything, from their clothing and from the air and from their water and from their food and from whatever the hell else.
Mhm.
Of course they had all of these, illnesses and diseases that, came up, and they seemingly without a direct cause, but taken together as a cause of just the general toxicity. And so, I think it's amazing that people are starting to become aware of that and trying to the extent possible that you can, living in a city in the developed world, scale back your exposure to that kind of stuff and try to limit it. And then I would say another big one is this general, because of all, there's a chicken and egg kind of question here, but let's just say because of all this detachment and this kind of seeming lack of meaning, the death of God and the detachment from nature and all this kind of stuff. And then what you do to fill the void. So whether it's alcohol or drugs or social media or addictions of, a variety of kinds, how much does that just, because, there's obviously a brain and body connection, right? The body is not separate units, it's an integrated unit. And how much of a signal are you sending to your body when you're living a life of such meaninglessness and despair and apathy for your health in all areas? So like, if you just don't give a shit and you watch Netflix and you eat junk food and you do drugs and you drink and all those other things, how is that not sending a signal to your body saying, I don't really care? So if you want to throw up a disease, a cancer, a tumor or whatever, like, and I'm not suggesting, this happened to your brother or whatever, but I do think this is part of the relationship that we have to our bodies, and saying like,
Absolutely.
your thoughts and your actions communicate things to your body on a level that we don't currently fully understand. And so are you sending the signals that you have a reason to live and you want to live and there's things you want to achieve and that there's gratitude for your existence and all the opportunities you have? Or are you sending a signal like, meh, I could take it or leave it? And, how is your body going to respond? And how would you think it would respond?
So I have two things with that too, because so after he passed away, I was obviously completely destroyed, and I was just smoking a ton of weed every day, eating just complete garbage, just destroying my body. And luckily Twitter just really woke me up to that, but it was just that's why I was trying to many different things to where I finally got to regenerative agriculture. I was just trying to find certain meaning, because I would just be pissing on my brother's grave if I just sat there like a lump for the rest of my life and didn't do anything meaningful, especially after everything we had just gone through. And then made me really just start thinking about just my bloodline, how all the sacrifices that happened for me to get here, I would be pissing on their graves too. And you're right. I mean, once I was able to find meaning and mission, because I have a mission in life that it's not just regenerative agriculture and not just the Regenaissance, that I'll be able to essentially work on the rest of my life and be completely fulfilled. And I was very intentional about trying to figure that out and discover. And yeah, because I was heading down a very dark path to where I was digging myself an early grave right next to my brother.
Yeah. Well, I think many of us probably have similar stories like that. And again, like, I think that characterizes the generation that we're in, like where there was such a lack of meaning that that void was filled, or it was attempted to be patched in so many different ways, destructive ways. And for whatever reason, it seems like that's really starting to turn around. Now, obviously, I think Bitcoin is a huge element to that, because once people kind of see how it can improve things on a fundamental level, and once people see how it affects their degree of hope, right? How it gives them, it allows them to look at the world through a hopeful lens rather than through a depressed lens or a lens of despair. Then I think that starts to awaken a lot of things inside of you. And one of them, I think that it's been my observation for a lot of people, is it also kind of tunes them to be able to determine what it is meaningful to them. And so when they cast their attention back out into the world, they're more capable of perceiving meaning. And that's such a, well, it's such a tremendous gift, but it's such an important thing, because you want to tune your attention and your focus to be able to identify things that are most meaningful and relevant, right? That's, that's kind of the name of the game, to kind of look out, and to be a bit dramatic here, but to see the kingdom of God, like when you look out on the world, and not just see all the noise and not just see all the bad stuff, but to look out and have like the good stuff and the meaningful stuff really glow for you, so that you know how to construe your behavior, so you know which path to take. And it really seems like, for those reasons, and I'm sure more, Bitcoin is allowing people, and perhaps it's just as simple as like this thing becomes so meaningful to them that the whole process of grappling with meaning and trying to understand why things are meaningful to you and what attributes or elements of them cause them to be, the experience of doing that with Bitcoin is giving them more, again, capacity or capability to do it with other things. But whatever the mechanism or ultimate cause is, I mean, that certainly seems to be the case. And I mean, I think that's the biggest possible solution to the problems we face that anyone could ever ask for, is like all these things we're discussing. The main issue is probably just a lack of meaning, apathy, and that bleeds into all these other issues. And if you can correct that, if you can turn that ship around to now having meaning and also being more capable of identifying and integrating meaning into your life, then that's righting the ship, right? That's turning things around and going in the right direction. And that seems to be what's happening with so many people right now.
I think that the other thing too, I'd like to add to that, especially in the context of human history, our generation have had it extremely easy, to where most of us, especially me, I had a really easy life. This was everything I went through with my brother and my mom. I mean, I would say that was my boy to man phase at 27, just because I had never gone through anything like that. But when you think about 200 years ago, you're used to death around your family, and you're working on the farm, you're working on the land as a kid. So you've built that, I guess, discipline and mental toughness in a way that a lot of us really have never really gone through. Because that's why it took me so long to get out of it. Once I was able to, I guess, overcome my personal life with my family, I didn't think I'd ever be this strong. I mean, I guess it just awakened something inside me that I just didn't realize it was possible. But I think that's also just reflecting on my friends and just a lot of the generation and how they go about life. I think that's one of the biggest reasons why too.
Couldn't agree more. And it's so interesting to see, these previously dormant or underdeveloped aspects of ourselves. People are now addressing them. They're really intentionally working on them because they realize the importance of them. And, there's an element of the times call for them as well, whether it's you want to, really want to engage that hopeful future or capitalize it, or you want to make sure you're formidable enough to see yourself through the potential chaos of what may be coming. Like both of those things are motivations to really, find those elements of you that have been neglected and, bring them up to snuff, basically, like develop them sufficiently so they can be useful to you. And I mean, it's your story and what we've been discussing. I mean, just seems to be what I'm seeing, particularly in Bitcoin, but outside of it as well. It just seems to be a lot of people are taking that approach. And, kind of encapsulating all that is a sense, and not to abdicate too much responsibility from our own choices, but there's a sense that like, oh, we've been lied to, like we've been, or at a minimum, we've been tricked or fooled in some way, not always to suggest it was intentionally lied to or tricked, but like something has pulled us off course, and it's so pervasive and it's everywhere. And the attempt is to identify what it is. Now, maybe it's as simple as like culture, right? Maybe it's like an animus more so than an intentional agenda by any group of people. And it's this animus that just causes you to over focus on the self and the ego, and under focus on whatever else is going on, or the spirit of chaos, as it's called, or whatever. Like maybe it's just that, and then it shows up everywhere, and then it creates an incentive structure around it, and then it kind of self-perpetuates. And maybe this is part of the cycle of human consciousness and human history, that it kind of always goes a little bit like that. You get consolidation and integration and advancement and progress, and then you get that kind of chaotic interlude where things get a little bit too untethered from the truth, and it's chaotic and it's painful, and it's that pain that ultimately brings you back to that closer tethering that allows you to move forward to the next step. I think there's some truth in that, but suffice it to say that this generation certainly seems like, one of the collective statements is, wow, we've been lied to, and we're not going to so easily trust from this point on. And you see that everywhere, and rightly so. I mean, I'm obviously a proponent of that, but it's so funny to me when people can't see that. A relevant current kind of example of this is the whole Rogan and Hotez and RFK, debate offer. And I see the mainstream people like talking about this thing as if they seem completely oblivious to the fact that so many people just don't trust them. Like the shock and the surprise and the authoritative air that they put on, like it seems unbelievable that they can't appreciate why people might not trust them for decades now of ridiculous behavior, but certainly for, the behavior over the last few years, that there would be a distrust or a skepticism in the institutions, be they of government, corporate institutions, nonprofit, whatever. Like it's just a general air of, well, kind of don't trust, verify, right? Or at least at a very minimum, I'm not going to just de facto trust you. You're going to have to earn my trust. And they seem completely oblivious to it. And of course, that's part of what causes this like polarization, right? Because there's one group that's like, I don't trust you at all. And the other one is like, how could you possibly not trust me? I come from the university. I come from come from CNN or what have you, or come from the government. And so I think what we're witnessing now is that kind of snapback from people feeling they've been tricked to now bringing, their kind of attention back inside in terms of trying to identify and develop what having been tricked has caused them to neglect. And then simultaneously to trying to improve that or bring that out is not falling prey to the same mistake again, which means not just instinctively trusting everyone, in the culture or in your life.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the first thing that came to mind was just big pharma, not even taking COVID and the vaccines. But I remember going back home because my parents still had cable TV, and every commercial break, there were at least minimum 1 to 2 pharmaceutical commercials. And then you look into the industry, they spend billions of dollars on marketing for that. How does that not make you question their actual motives behind all that, especially given we're essentially the only country that allows that? They have New Zealand, but it's nothing like what's allowed in America for pharmaceutical commercials. And then you actually watch the commercials, and at the end of every commercial, they have a laundry list of possible side effects. And it's just insanity how we've become so desensitized to that particular thing that that just makes me question everything with health related, because now there's a new approved drug for weight loss, and I already know that's going to have really bad consequences. And that just warps our perception too overall as health. It's just, we can just fix it with a pill, rather than actually taking the holistic approach that's necessary in order to live a long, healthy life.
Yeah. But I don't know much about, I heard some hoopla about that pill a few weeks ago, but what I just keep coming back to this notion that there just is no free lunch, right? Like, and this is part of the issue with quote unquote modern culture, is that they isolate one variable and try to optimize or resolve that. And they completely ignore all the things peripheral to it that might be damaged or impaired as a result. And again, the COVID stuff is a perfect example, right? Like focusing on one metric. So like lock everyone down because that is somehow going to do some good, versus all the harm and damage that one particular action creates, right? But if you're only focusing on what it's meant to improve and ignoring all that, then you're going to keep doing it, which was the case, right? And with, a drug like for weight loss, it's like, maybe let's just say it's effective. Let's say it helps you lose weight, but where else might it be causing problems? And I don't even just mean in the realm of the physiological effects of whatever the drug, route or the drug impact is. Like maybe it's bad for your liver or it causes some harm elsewhere. But I also mean like psychologically, like, is it good that you can take a pill and lose weight and achieve something that you like, that you desire? Like, is it good to be able to achieve something you desire without the requisite work? Like long term, is it good? Like, does it not kind of impair your own development, your own capacity to pursue things that are meaningful to you if you continue to be able to achieve it or acquire it by some other means? And I'm pretty sure the answer is no there. I don't think there's a free lunch. Like, if the whole thing with meaning is that if you're going to be able to access it and access the fruits of integrating it or bringing it into your life, it requires sacrifice, effort, discipline, work, all those things. And if you can somehow get it without that, let's put it this way, those things, though they may seem like they're a cost for accessing meaning, I actually think they are an integral component of the meaning itself.
Yeah.
And so to try to avoid them is a fool's errand, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you're not addressing any of the problems that got you there in the first place. And it makes me think about, especially for men, therapy. It's really being pushed a lot. And I tried that a few times with my particular stuff with my brother. And it doesn't address a lot of the root issues, especially for men. We need a mission in life. I think that is actually hardwired in our DNA. And you could just talk about everything, and then you just go back and you're still having these major issues that are causing all of that in the first place. And that's the same thing with this fat loss drug, is the fact that you still take it, but you still have these awful habits. And it's just pretty much a moot point at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be helpful to talk about things that are bothering you, but I do agree with your point that, and as part of the issue with so much of this is everything is multifaceted and multi-layered, and that's everything's connected, as we were saying before, right? So just single something out and try to fix that without fixing everything around it, it's going to be limited improvements at best. But I think you're right. Like if you were in a culture where, the more the masculine elements of yourself, let's say, were properly developed, and you were pursuing what's most meaningful to you, and you had a community of men around you that were doing something similar, how much more beneficial would that be at resolving whatever issues then came up? And of course, fewer would, because you would have addressed them all along the way and they wouldn't have had a chance to metastasize, let's say. But how much more effective would that be at resolving those issues than, the modern man who sits in a cubicle for 8-9 hours a day, picks up some food on the way home, goes home, watches Netflix, jerks off, goes to bed, and does it like all over again 7 days a week or 5 days a week, and then gets blasted on the weekends, and then is told like, well, go share your feelings with a therapist, and everything will be better, or like, don't be afraid to talk, or that kind of stuff. I mean, it's night and day, right? And so much of the problem, or so much of the capacity to improve the problem is in, not waiting for it to get to such a destructive sort of place, or to become such a big problem.
Yeah. Well, I know especially in Bitcoin, we talk about low and high time preference a lot. A big issue is we don't think long-term at all. And so this is also why I was trying to really figure out my mission, but also you mentioned community. That was another thing that really helped me, was Brotherhood, and leaning into that, because life still happens. I mean, at the day of my launch on May 28th, my mom passed away 4 hours after that. And
Man.
I mean, I was expecting that for a while. Obviously, she was in a really bad spot, but things will just continue on happening in my life. But I can still continue on with my life as well and push forward, because I was able to do that deep work. If I didn't do that, I would just be, I mean, again, probably just a sinking ship, smoking more weed, probably drinking and all that. And that was because I was thinking long term.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the capacity for Bitcoin to kind of inculcate certain ideas or principles into us strikes again, let's say, because low time preference is one of the things that everyone learns as they go through their Bitcoin journey. And again, I think what's happening is maybe you realize the importance or relevance or benefit of it in Bitcoin as a result of that particular journey, but then you realize how broadly applicable it is to other areas of meaning, and how useful it can be in those domains as well. And yeah, man, it's so crazy because the solution seems so simple, doesn't it? Like when we talk about all these problems and, all the YouTube, all the podcasts and the news shows, everyone's, talking about politics and this and that, but it seems so simple, like just getting back to the basics of not being so detached, building strong, healthy families within, strong communities where, honesty and integrity are the baseline, and they're built into the baseline, not just morally in terms of whatever spirituality people use to, establish that, but also in terms of the money, right? Sound money, Bitcoin, whatever. Like it's not that complicated, when people are decrying the state of the world these days and thinking like, well, how the hell do we resolve this? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's that much of a stretch, which is what encourages me greatly, because it means that the change can happen, rather quickly if everyone, if enough people were to kind of see things that way. And again, I'm very encouraged by that. I mean, you're a great example, as are so many people in the space. 3-4 years ago, probably a fairly different person, different ambitions, different drives, different behaviors, different habits, different ways of thinking, all that stuff. And now look at you, albeit you're still, I'm sure you'd admit, like early stages of the journey, but you're more clear about what you need to focus on and from where you derive meaning and what you want to be involved in and why you're doing it. Like there's an intention and there's a consciousness about why you're doing what you're doing. And I mean, that's really it, and then it's just a matter of running the clock forward and being, dedicated and committed to continuing to refine yourself and try to understand yourself better and understand the things that motivate you, the values, the principles, the ambitions. And I think that's how we get to the better place, right? And so, and Bitcoin seems to be a tremendous catalyst for that. So encouraged, I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
You're spot on with simple too, because like I was saying, with especially for Regenaissance, trying to reconnect us back to food production, essentially, I think it's simple because the first time, whenever I was traveling to these different ranches and whatnot and had actual fresh beef, I've never had anything like that. It tastes vastly different than anything I've ever had in the grocery stores. And it was literally life-changing because it's just, I spent 27 years and I've never had food this delicious and nutritious. And that's why I'm trying to really go back to developing relationships with your local farms and ranches and buying from farmers markets, because once you're able to do that, it makes it much easier to eat healthy food. Because I mean, the food that we have in the grocery stores, especially all the ultra processed food, that is literally scientifically like modified for us to be addicted to that. So our brains are so like, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's just our brains are just have changed because of that type of food. Once you can break that habit and actually eat nutrient dense food, you won't ever think about those cravings for just the pure garbage that most people eat now.
Yeah. Oh, it feels vastly different, especially once you start stacking those lifestyle hacks, or hacks not the right word, like lifestyle fundamentals together. I mean, it becomes an addiction, just like your prior food or substance addiction. Because if you can be eating really healthy, really nutritious food, if you can be eating it in the right way or the right setting, if you can stack on, good sleep and exercise and strong, trusting relationships and work that's meaningful, and you just continue to stack it. I mean, that's how you live, in my opinion, as far as I can tell, that's how you live a happy, integrated, meaningful life. And it just, every time you find something that you can tweak or add into that mix, like fit it in properly, I mean, it makes you feel stronger on every level. And it's such a, such a great feeling. And, when I was, like I smoked a bunch of weed when I was a teenager as well, and kind of intermittently in my early 20s. I lived in China for most of that. And it's not that common there. So it wasn't something I did often, but anytime I would go back to it, I would just feel like, and I was a huge advocate for like I remember I wrote in grade 10 or 11, I wrote a persuasive essay in English class of why marijuana should be legalized, right? And I went down the rabbit hole, and and I do think it's absurd, all the reasons why it was made illegal and the corruption and this, that whole story. But I do feel most often like an overuse of it took me out of the type of clarity that was dawning on me, that allowed me to see what was most important and meaningful and engage it in the way that I wanted to. It would kind of fog up my perception of my life rather than give me clarity. Now, maybe in like isolated cases, if I was trying to break a creative blockage, or I'm not saying I would never use it again, but it was at the level of usage, I recognize it as being something that was impairing me rather than promoting me or making me stronger, or permitting me to pursue the things that I wanted to pursue. And so I think that too is happening to a lot of people, that they're identifying these things in their life, whether it's weed or Netflix or bad relationships or bad food, that are holding them back. Now that there's this meaningful thing drawing them forward, part of the game is just be like, well, what's holding me back? And if you wake up in modern culture in 2023, you probably, there's quite a few things that are holding you back. So I think a big part of the process for a lot of people initially, and this goes back to kind of the trust conversation earlier, is just being like, wait, like, hold the fuck on, just everything stop. I need to look around in my, environment, my both physical and, mental environment, and be like, where are the things that just need to be gotten rid of, right? There's too much noise. There's too much weight. There's too much negative influence. What needs to be gotten rid of before I even think about adding on, right? Like, how do I just get rid of the things that are not serving me, whether it's poor or untruthful or corrupted information, or whether it's, relationships or food or things in my environment or whatever. And then you can start the process of building up from there. And that's it, man. Like, I think that's the right approach. And a lot of people seem to be doing it. And it sounds like what you're undertaking now is basically will serve as a resource for people that are doing that, at least for your particular area. So when people are trying to recapitulate their diet and reorient themselves in that way, or in that domain rather, they'll have what you do as a resource to kind of give them the information they need to make informed decisions there, right? And then, of course, to kind of express their pride, their interest, their why they feel that way of eating or growing their food is important and valid, because as we've been saying, community is a big part of what we do and is a big part of health generally.
Yeah, no, you're 100% spot on, because that's funny. That's exactly what I did those last 6 months of 2021 after my brother died, because Twitter essentially saved my life in a lot of ways. I was doing a lot of unlearning and learning, but I would essentially say I was attending Twitter University for a few months, because I was just so many different niches: health, esoteric health, nutrition, regenerative agriculture, Bitcoin. And yeah, that was essentially the catalyst for overcoming all my stuff, was all this unlearning and learning. And then I would audit my environment and everything that I do and believe. And it took a long time, but I think I was building a new foundation where I didn't really have a foundation, I realized. So yeah, I completely echo everything you said on that.
Was it a moment when you realized that you needed to take that approach, or was it just kind of a slow burn over time? And if it was the former, was it shocking? Was it difficult to deal with when you kind of realized that's what you needed to do, or what was that process like?
That's a good question. I would say it was kind of a slow burner at the start, because when I was my brother's caretaker, he spent the first pretty much half of that 6 months back at our parents' place. We were in the same room, and that's when I learned he was using Twitter, but for just educational purposes, especially for Bitcoin. And so I was starting to see the value in Twitter for that first time ever, because I used to use it for just the stupid toxic reasons that a lot of Twitter is. but there's a lot of utility in it. And I think it was also out of just not wanting to leave my apartment. I just stayed there pretty much all day. Didn't want to move. So it was, I guess, just by that too, is just the fact that I've got this and I was just following a lot of counts and I started seeing the value in a lot of it. And then it, I guess, picked up pretty quickly after that, I would say.
Are there any accounts on Twitter that you think, because I guess we're all always looking for those resources that we can at least cautiously have some semblance of trust in. Are there any resources that you've come across over the last couple of years that have really helped you in any particular way?
Yeah, there's a ton. The one account that made me switch from being vegan to eating animal protein again was Alexander Cortez. I think he goes by Ajax, but he's huge in that, but also just fitness and just overall health. Very good stuff. In terms of like mentality and mindset, that was another thing that I was really trying to work on. Zach Hummel is incredible for that. I'm trying to remember Twitter handles. I can't really off the top of my head. There's so many.
There's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I can probably tweet that out, because that was the great thing about this Regenaissance too, was I was able to send shirts to a lot of folks that had made such a massive impact on me in such a short amount of time, because that's a great thing about Twitter. Whenever you figure that out, they're just pumping all this out for free. You get to learn about all of that, and it's incredible.
Totally. Were you in any sort of like vegan community when you were vegan, or was that just kind of something you did by yourself?
No, I couldn't stand them. So it was just me, and the only person else was my girlfriend at the time who transitioned to be vegan. And outside of that, yeah, I did not associate with them at all.
Did you feel many physiological differences when you switched diets?
Yeah, I'm still, that's been a long story in itself. I've had a whole huge laundry list of health issues as well. So whenever I switched back, I realized now I had low acidic stomach, but what the gastro kept telling me was I had an over acidic stomach. So they would just pump me with antacids, which is just completely wrong. But I also started just eating a bunch of junk after that, to where I have a really inflamed colon and just a whole other issues, to where I learned this January I have Hashimoto's. So I'm in the process of fixing that, as well as other nutrient deficiencies that I had through blood work. Mm-hmm. But I didn't even really, I guess I realized I haven't even talked about that, was the fact how much not only healthcare really failed for a lot of the experiences with my brother, but me personally. I've spent thousands and thousands of dollars the last 2 years on tests for them to not really figure anything out and not help me in the slightest, to where I've had to essentially do my own independent stuff, to where I finally got answers and am able to now finally address that. That's another reason why I have Regenaissance, is just so we don't rely on a lot of the doctors and healthcare that's in America, because it's a total mess.
It's so frustrating. And it's not just the States. I mean, maybe the cost is of particular note in the States, but I mean, the real punchline is don't get sick, because once you get sick, you get put into a system. I mean, again, like there's a lot of well-meaning people in it. It's just not optimized for health. It's optimized for treating symptoms as quickly as possible from the doctor's side and as profitably as possible from the pharmaceutical side. Both of those incentives do not bode well for the patient. The doctor has to see 100 people a day or whatever it is. So they want to just, what's the cost? Again, back to this point of like isolating one thing and forgetting everything else. What's the symptom? Oh, that's a symptom. Well, I had a very nice, well put together pharmaceutical rep in my office a month ago, and he took me on a very nice trip to Florida, and he told me that this is the new thing they've developed. It took $10 billion to develop, state of the art. This is the pill for the thing you have. Take it and come back in 6 weeks. And that's just basically how it works. And again, it doesn't lead to great outcomes. And then, as you say, you have to take it upon yourself to do the research. You have to go into your particular issue. Nobody knows it better than yourself, after all. And then you walk into the doctor's office, and on the wall, they have a framed picture of like, Google didn't go to med school for 4 years, or some like snarky remark about the patient trying to like look into their own health. Mm-hmm. and then of course it costs you an arm and a leg to get access to that, either through direct payments or through taxes or insurance, whatever. So yeah, it's completely fucked. And back to our point, it's like, well, what's the solution? Well, the solution is simple as shit, most of the time. Now if things have progressed really far, then maybe there isn't solutions, or maybe they're a little bit more challenging. But like for a lot of people, I think this stat won't be exactly right, but it's something like 80 to 85% of illnesses or hospital visits or whatever it is are lifestyle diseases. So basically, brought on by how you choose to live. And if you lived a healthier lifestyle, and I think, you're probably angle on this, as is many in the Bitcoin space, is like a diet high in meat, high in saturated fats, and then the details, maybe people tweak for their own liking, but something like that, organic, grass-fed, free range meat, things like that. If that, and exercise and sunlight and good water and, basic stuff, which everyone did kind of by default, like, well, in certain places of the world now, and in many places of the world, 100 years ago or so. But if you did that, you'd probably find that a lot of those issues resolve themselves over time. Like you're putting your body back into a position where it can function normally. And so, those functions that are impaired because of all the different things you're doing, you take the cause of that impairment away and you give it what it needs to regenerate. And what do you know? Like it actually does that. And again, it's just an example of this massive problem and this super complex, corrupt, poor incentives solution that isn't actually effective anyways, being conjured up to address that problem, when the solution is just extremely, the correct solution, or the most beneficial solution, is just extremely simple. And again, this goes back to that point at the beginning of the inversion of the truth that characterizes clown world, because it's like, oftentimes it seems these days, the truth is actually the complete opposite, or the inversion of what people say it is, or what's being done.
Yeah. And it's also funny whenever you were mentioning about the doctor with the Google image, it's so ironic, because I've noticed, this is all anecdotally, all of the doctors, with my brother's experience, with my experience throughout all the years, is they stop researching after they get the degree.
Yeah.
So, and that in itself is just funny to me. But then also I have two examples too. With that example of the overacidic stomach, I was still having continuous issues on the farm to where I had no idea what was going on. And I went to one of the gastros, and the first thing I said when I walked in is, "Don't prescribe me antacids." And she just jokingly checked off the box saying, "Oh, there goes my first line of defense." And it's just like, oh, that's where we're at as a healthcare, is that summarized right there.
Yeah.
And that's just so frustrating. But then also this past January, I had a fun near-death experience that ended me in the ER. And whenever I first got there, I was severely dehydrated. I was in just such rough shape. Obviously, I couldn't really figure out what was going on. And they said I had really inflamed colon, but they didn't give me any fluids or anything. So they sent me back, and I went back to my Airbnb, and I could feel myself almost passing out again. And so I had to go back to the ER, and they gave me 2 liters of fluid, and I finally felt okay. But because of that mistake, I might end up having to pay $3,000. Fortunately, I'm part of Crowd Health, and we're working on that. But that's just so ridiculous. For a little mishap because of them not giving me any fluids could potentially cost me $3,000.
Yeah, it's so crazy. Again, the incentives are super messed up. And then you go into any hospital and you look at the food that they're giving people. It's almost like it's intentionally trying to keep them in there. And to maybe the archetypal example of this whole, like the truth or the best thing is actually the inverse, or is like doing nothing instead of overdoing things, is fasting. I don't know if you have much experience with it. I don't have a ton of experience with it, especially not longer term, like more than 3-day fast. But you look at the historical literature, and even if there's not at those times like scientific literature, but you look at traditional uses of fasting in a variety of cultures all around the world. Oftentimes if you had something that was ailing you, if you were sick in some way, or even if you were like mentally or spiritually sick. I mean, fasting has been used as a means of inducing a type of mystical or spiritual experience even. So like, it's like the ultimate do nothing, which is basically like, don't eat anything and only have water. Turns out that it has, you know, seemingly quite effective, even sometimes remarkable ability to ameliorate, improve, or fix the very thing that ails you, whether it be physical or spiritual, you know? So that theme just keeps reemerging, and it seems to have a lot of merit.
Yeah, I mean, in the holistic, I guess, space too, it's being more talked about now is fasting whenever you have cancer, because of that exact reason, is just starving it. And so it makes me, I don't know, it's interesting, especially after reflecting on all the treatments and whatnot for my brother, just how differently it could have gone about all of that, and just if he could still be alive today. So that's, but also now knowing what I know now too, I could have really helped him preventing getting colon cancer in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure that's part of the motivation that drives you forward in what you're doing now, you know, that you can share potentially life-saving or at least life-improving information with, you know, people who are, you know, need it or are looking for it, or, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, if I helped just one family prevent what I've gone through, I will die a happy man,
So,
because yeah, everything that I've gone through, I don't recommend, or I don't wish on my worst enemy. So
yeah,
that's the motivating factor in it all. I mean, I would say pain fuels my fire, and my fire is the mission.
that's awesome. What do you see as, how do you think that mission is going to develop, you know, into the future? Right now, it's information, articles, newsletters, and t-shirts. How do you see this movement or this community developing?
Yeah, so my whole just overall mission in life is just breaking the generational chain on health and nutrition, because we pass down all of our knowledge to our kids. Whenever you see an overweight child, you're probably going to assume that their parents are overweight, severely overweight too. And so I'd say long term, it's just a whole lot of education, because I, again, want to get into ranching my own. I also want to eventually educate the next generation on getting into regenerative agriculture, because another big issue that we're facing, especially in America, half of our farmland is changing hands by the end of 2030, but most of them don't have an heir to where they can pass that down to. And so I'm really trying to find incentives to get people into agriculture, because it's not easy work at all. That's what you will notice immediately whenever you volunteer and work on a farm, just how much work goes into it, especially physical labor, a very stressful environment, especially with uncontrollable elements such as the weather. So I'd say education is the biggest thing, and then just leading by example whenever I do my own ranching.
Do you think you'll do, you know, events or, I don't know, more things that involve like meet space gatherings of these like-minded people or community members?
For sure, especially because I'm in Austin, Texas, and I
Right.
mean, especially with Bitcoin too, because I've noticed the huge trend. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Beef Initiative.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just the whole trend of just being self-sovereign. Once you just really reflect on, after you learn about Bitcoin, but just reflecting on your health and food production, you just go down that rabbit hole and you just take full responsibility for everything. So I'm trying to, I guess, nudge people, and a lot of events, especially in a community oriented city like Austin, I definitely plan to do.
Yeah. You know, another way of just easily characterizing what we've been discussing, you know, because we often talk about kind of Bitcoin, being interested in Bitcoin because you're interested in truth, and then having, you know, that be kind of like a mutual feedback thing, and then looking for truth everywhere else. But it also, like, it just seems to inculcate an attitude of like no bullshit, you know, like which is basically the same as pursuing truth, but a little bit more playful. And it's like, I think Bitcoiners just look at all areas of their life and like, I don't want bullshit in the political category, in the health and food category, in the medicine, in the government, in the finance, whatever. I don't want any fucking bullshit. And I can smell your bullshit a mile away. So, you know, like if you're selling that shit, I'm not buying it. And it's so great to, and because, you know, having your wealth stored in a way that people can't extract from you really emboldens someone to say that, to say no, to say no bullshit, to say fuck you, basically,
Yeah.
because it's like you're way less impervious to whatever ways they might try to, manipulate you or get back at you for that attitude. And the more people that come in, the more those people are emboldened, because we're dealing with an absolutely scarce money here, right? So the more people that avail of that benefit, the more that those who have already done so are like, get even more of that invigorating boldness. And so, I think all this groundswell we're seeing right now, where there's a lot of people starting to get into the regenerative agriculture stuff. There's obviously a lot of great entrepreneurs out there starting awesome businesses. Like just watching this kind of pulse as it grows. I don't know if you've ever seen like a time lapse of like a mold on a tree, but it kind of like it pulses forward and then it retracts a little bit, but then it pulses even further forward. And that's kind of how I see these Bitcoin cycles and the activity that's happening within them. And it all just, I mean, I know I've said this several times already, but where once I was extremely pessimistic about the prospects for the world, broadly speaking, now like every day I'm just more optimistic and more emboldened and more hopeful for it, because I have these conversations with people like you who are doing cool things, and I have them all the time. And I love that I get to do that. And I just kind of think like all the pieces are coming together, and the really important pieces, the really fundamental things that we touched on earlier. And how can that not lead to an improved circumstance? And the beautiful thing is it's not even really people being persuaded en masse, because persuasion is always really a hard thing. It's people realizing themselves that, that changes need to be made, or that a better way is available, or that truth, greater approximation of truth is available, and then just pursuing their own self-interest based on that. And then once they take care of their own self-interest, there's this impulse to share the love, basically, to not only improve their own circumstance, but try to contribute to the improvement of other people's circumstances. And I mean, what more do you want, basically?
Yeah, I mean, that's the two biggest things that give me hope in life for Bitcoin and regenerative agriculture, which is why I was so gung-ho about the beef initiative. It's just, once I was able to find that truth, I could find myself just working in those spaces for the rest of my life. Just, there's so much that goes into it, that it gives me a lot of hope.
That's so awesome, man. I love to hear that. Was there anything you wanted to touch on or discuss before we shut it down?
I guess just the last thing, because you were saying with Bitcoiners just finding the truth and sniffing out the bullshit. The other thing too is just it sniffs out the future bullshit. So for example, it's Bill Gates funded. Have you heard of Apparel?
No.
So it's this plant-based sticker that they're placing on our produce in grocery stores, and it's essentially modifying its shelf life. I don't know the full specifics, but it keeps just the moisture internally of the produce, to where if you go to the website, there's like a scale that it shows of what a regular avocado looks like, and a avocado with this Apparel sticker on it. And it goes to like 30 days, where the left one obviously rots and the right one is not. And I sniff that out a mile away, because that's going just completely against our nature. And that's what I'm noticing more and more, is just a lot of things that we're trying to do is just not natural at all, like lab grown meat. And there's more studies coming out that that's actually way worse for the environment than even conventional agriculture. And that's also why I like that, because you can start sniffing out that stuff that's really pushed on us.
It'd be interesting. One of the questions I have is, so I mean, this is not necessarily what I think is happening with Bitcoin, but there's obviously been many instances in the past where there's been like a somewhat of a Ludditism that's reemerged in the culture, right? Where there's been, because I think it's a very sensible response to chaos. Like when things get kind of too out of control, you revert back to what's been proven and what works, right? Tradition, basically. And so that's happened throughout history many times. My question is, so we're in another one of these periods, it seems, where things got too out of control and too chaotic, and there's a reversion back to prior knowledge, prior traditions, prior forms of behavior. What I'm curious about is what will we like, how will we take those things, and what elements of modern culture, of technological culture, of the so-called digital age or whatever, what elements will we accept as being legitimate and valid and not chaos inducing, let's say, and combine with those traditional forms of knowledge and behavior and methods in order to move forward in a way that we deem that we would characterize as progress. So like where will the line be of rejecting modernity and going back to tradition versus pulling forward tradition and leveraging modernity? And it's, there's no right answer. No one has the answer, right? We're kind of figuring that out, but it will be interesting because there's so much rejection right now. Where do we find the balance or the synthesis between the two?
To me, especially for agriculture, it's all about incentives and decentralization, because that's just the biggest hurdle, especially with the younger generation. I remember talking to the farm owner that I was on. He was talking about how he struggles just to have any type of help. And I know that's not just him at all. When you think about being able to find some easy customer service job to where you can just sit at your desk for $15 an hour versus doing backbreaking work for $10 an hour, the incentives just aren't there. And I think that's the biggest hurdle in trying to get more and more folks into agriculture. Because like I was saying, it's insanely hard work, but it's also the most fulfilling work I've ever done. Working those farmers markets and hearing the feedback from all the customers and just how thankful they are for all of that is such an incredible feeling. But yeah, the incentives currently aren't there.
Yeah. Well, that kind of is an element of what we were discussing before. Like, what are how much do you value what you're getting in return for certain work? And that'll determine whether you think it's a good trade, right? So if you're only focusing on the monetary aspect, which in this fiat culture of artificial deprivation, you are incentivized to do. So you're incentivized to take the $15 an hour over the $10 an hour. And if that is your primary metric of assessment, you're going to do it and then suffer the consequences of making that decision. But if things started to change, and if things weren't as, artificially scarce, let's say, then I think we could both imagine a circumstance where a young person might say, well, it's $10 versus $15, but I get to be outside. I get to be in the sun. I get to have my feet and my hands in the soil. I actually like the fact that it's going to be physical and work because I want that. It's going to be around people that I respect and that I want to learn from. It's going to, bring me closer to nature so I can observe the cycle. Like all those little non-obvious things, I think that people will be more conscious of, and not only more conscious of, but they'll elevate in their importance, and they'll become a legitimate component of when you compared, two different opportunities. And, so I think, again, that's just how it slowly turns around, is more and more people just saying like, well, yeah, it's $5 less an hour, but net, I think I'm way up. So I'm going to choose the thing that's in my best interest. It's really just a matter of properly identifying and valuing, or properly identifying what it is that's in your best interest. So many people today make that kind of like deal with the devil. They think, the bigger salary is in their best interest, but they're locked in a massive city. They're in a tiny, apartment. They're in a cubicle all day under gray light, exposed to all sorts of toxins, very cut off from, human connection, unhealthy lifestyle, alcohol on the weekends. And you put it all together and you're like, is that in my best interest? Or should I just go and choose something else that pays way less, but is actually better for me, And so, of course, everyone has to make those decisions for themselves. And there's no absolute right answer, but I'm hopeful that we're entering an era where people make those decisions. People are more aware of the decisions they're actually making, I guess is the right way to put it. And then we'll see what kind of things people value. And I think it's heading in the right direction. So
I'm there with you. No, I think a lot of people are starting to really question, wake up. But then even like you're saying, leaving the city, there's so many, even just on YouTube, regenerative agriculture channels of their first generation farmers, but they were just sick of their tech job and being in the city and they just wanted to get out. So I'm noticing that trend more and more as well.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Me too. Well, man, this has been great and kind of a long time coming. So I'm glad you hit me back up and finally we put this together. Did you want to just shout out the destinations and stuff one more time if people want to, buy t-shirts, check out your work, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So currently I'm mainly just using Twitter. You can find me at _Regenaissance. And then my website is theregenaissance.co. And yeah, you can just find me on there.
Awesome. Well, look, man, thanks again for coming on and best of luck in everything you're doing. And we'll have to have another catch up in a year or so and see where things are at then.
Sounds good. Thank you, John, for having me.
All right, brother. Take care.